Now, we also know that the concentration of fossil fuel production in a small group of countries will increase their ability to impose high prices. I certainly will not get into a projection of prices in the future as far as oil is concerned. I made that hazardous attempt way back in the early 80s, and Johns Hopkins University Press, in fact, published a book of mine called The Political Economy of Global Energy, in which I projected substantial increases in oil prices, but immediately after the book came out, oil prices crashed. And I can tell you, so did the sales of my book. So I'm actually saddled with a pretty large quantity because the publishers sent back a large number. So, I've learned the hard way that projecting oil prices is an extremely hazardous undertaking. But we do know that oil prices could be subject to very sharp increases in the future. Now, I don't want to spend too much time because Professor Yumkela and Ambassador Kiri have already highlighted the problems that we face in several developing countries, the 1.6 billion people who don't have access to electricity. And we know that developing countries are expected to contribute 70% to the increase in global primary energy use by 2030. And I think this is a reality that we have to accept and address, because you cannot possibly have two sets of consumption patterns in the same world. And there is a set of growing aspirations in the developing countries, quite apart from the political and sociological compulsions which require addressing the issue of energy access. Now, here I would like to highlight China's important dependence will grow from 50% to 75% of its total oil demand. This will certainly put major pressure on the global oil market, as indeed would other developing countries. So let me also now turn to the issue of climate change, which is something that I believe requires very urgent action, and I hope the agreement that we expect in Copenhagen will provide a framework on the basis of which countries and different regions of the world can bring about a substantial shift. We know, for instance, that unfortunately our record in the last 3 or 4 decades doesn't cover us with glory at all. As a matter of fact, between the period 1970 and 2004, there's been an increase in emissions of greenhouse gases of 70%. In the case of the absence of near-term introduction of policy actions, we know that energy-related greenhouse gas emissions are projected to rise by over 50% by 2030. Clearly an unacceptable state of affairs, as I would like to point out by reference to what's going to happen with the climate of this world. If we look at carbon dioxide emissions, you find that we have clearly, in the last few decades, made a substantial and dramatic departure from the stability, the relative stability that existed for about 10,000 years. Now, you must have seen this picture in Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, and to dramatize what he was talking about, he actually climbed an elevator to go up this sharp increase trend that you see in the past few decades. I'm afraid I don't have that facility here, but you'll have to take my word for it. And I've already said the increase in the last 3 decades clearly shows that the global community has not responded with a sense of responsibility in meeting this enormous challenge. We know that reductions in energy-related CO2 emissions really give you a whole range of opportunities to bring about a shift. I might tell you that we are on the verge of embarking on work to produce the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. In fact, next month we have a week-long meeting to scope out this particular activity, and we are looking at a whole different range of scenarios for the future which would also give us the opportunity possibly of bringing about a reduction in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Because if we really want to stabilize the Earth's climate, there may be no other choice but to look at that kind of scenario. I'll quickly go through this because I'm sure everybody over here is familiar with this diagram, which shows that on the basis of observations, changes in global average surface temperature have exhibited a great deal of variation in the past, and that's largely because we have both natural as well as human-induced effects that bring about a change in climate. But I'm sorry, the trend over here is not very clearly shown in these two lines. They should have shifted a little bit, but I think something's gone wrong over here. But essentially, in the 20th century, we had an increase of 0.74 degrees Celsius. But if you look at the last 50 years, the slope is much sharper, much steeper. And therefore, we are seeing today a much greater increase in temperatures than has existed in the past. And certainly, you can see that from the fact that 11 of the last 12 years have been among the 12 warmest years since we've maintained instrumental record of temperature changes. And I quickly go through this. The first is essentially a replica of what I just showed, but the second shows you increases in sea level. And that in the 20th century has amounted to 17 centimeters. I'm happy to know that we're going to be discussing climate change from the perspective of the small island developing states. And if you live in one of those, and you have land areas which are barely a meter above sea level, then 17 centimeters increase in the 20th century is clearly a source of great consternation and insecurity. Because with that kind of sea level rise, every time you have a storm surge, every time you have a cyclonic activity, you would certainly see major damage to life and property. And this is a very perceptible indication of what's happening to the bodies of ice. I come from a region of the world where we are deeply concerned about the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayan range because a large number of rivers in the northern part of the subcontinent originate over there. And the IPCC has estimated that this could affect water availability and perhaps induce water stress for about 500 million people in South Asia and around 250 million people in China. Now, our projections for this century in terms of temperature increase indicate that we could have increases anywhere from 1.1 to 6.4 degrees Celsius. At the lower end, we've come up with the best estimate of 1.8 degrees, and at the upper end, 4 degrees Celsius. Now, even at the lower end, if we get 1.8 degrees, that clearly will bring about impacts that would be certainly not acceptable. Just to give you an example, there would be impacts on food supply as a result of high temperature, drought, flood conditions, soil degradation. As a result, we could have major declines in yields of several crops. And the figure that I'd like to point out to you is the prospect for several countries in Africa, where by 2020, as early as that, we may get a reduction of about 50% in agricultural yields.